So America would probably love to have Europe start a war with Russia. And as soon as Europe is in a smoldering heap of ash, America will do what it's done twice. It will put all these European countries into debt, and it will come riding in at the last minute and declare victory.
This was Patrick Henningsen. Patrick is a journalist, filmmaker, broadcaster, and the founder of 21st Century Wire. He has spent years digging into how wars, crises, and political dramas are packaged and sold to us through the mainstream media. Today we are going to slow down and talk about some of the stories of that very machinery. Who shapes them and why? How narratives get coordinated, how critical voices get silenced. So, in this conversation, forget the headlines for a moment. We are going to step back, zoom out, and let Patrick walk us through how the information game really works. But before we dive in, a quick invitation if you want to go further than this conversation will allow. If you're interested in the bigger, messier picture of global power, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, the Middle East, that's what my Substack is for. Long form pieces on international shifts, narrative warfare, and the way global actors collide and collude on the world stage. And if you care about what all of this means for Europe, not as an afterthought, but as a center of gravity in its own right, that's where my work on Medium comes in. There, I look at Europe from a Europe first perspective. The collapse of its strategic autonomy, its blind spots, and the distorted stories Europeans are told about their own place in the world. So, if this interview sparks questions, don't stop there. Pick the lens you need, global on Substack, European on Medium, and follow the questions to wherever they are not supposed to go. Patrick Henningsen. Yeah, what a pleasure having you. How are you?
It was great. Great to be with you, Thomas.
Likewise. I know you're very busy. I have seen, I don't know how many interviews in preparation to this interview with you. You're quite diverse, but you're mainly a British-based journalist, broadcaster, and geopolitical commentator. And I saw also you have a news site, 21st Century Wire, and you're also having a analytical program, Sunday Wire. And I
Yes.
think one last thing to highlight is that you actually have been on the ground, and please correct me if I'm wrong, in places like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. So you're really in the midst of it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I've been also to Donbass as well in 2024 and a few other places. But yeah, if I'm able to. I try to do as much work as I can on location when I can. But it's very busy now because I do mostly studio based journalism these days.
I understand. I don't know if you know him. I interviewed Patrick Barb, who also was in on both sides of the fence, actually, in Russia and in Ukraine, and he faced dire consequences for it, which brings me right away to Chuck Board, who was
Mm.
sanctioned by the EU. Maybe I want to comment.
Yes, that's a kind of disturbing story. It's one of those commentators that a lot of people really respect and trust. He's got a very straightforward, apolitical delivery. And the thing that strikes me the most about Jacques Baud is that he was one of the first people to uh, put down on paper initially an article right after the Ukraine conflict blew up. I think he penned a piece in March of 2022 that outlined exactly the conditions that led to the conflict, and also his knowledge of what was going on with the OSCE at the time, and also his experience with Swiss and NATO intelligence. He has a great career, and recently he has been doing quite a lot of media interviews, and I'd say the last 6 months he's been more prevalent on some of the high profile podcasts, and he's put a book out. And he's also been talking about some very uncomfortable truths in Ukraine politically, and that's that there is a resistance bloc in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, against the government who opposes NATO's proxy war. And that's something that nobody in the West wants to be said in public, because it undercuts the narrative that the way that the Western governments are selling this war to their population is that the Ukrainians are resisting Russian aggression, and we must help them in every way possible. And so Jack Bowd threatens that. He really undercuts that with his credibility. So it's interesting they're going after someone like him, probably one of the most respected and qualified commentators. If you think about the blogosphere on YouTube, I mean, there's a lot of commentators, a lot of journalists, people who haven't really been on the ground, don't have an intimate knowledge of European intelligence and the political and military landscape in that part of the world. And he has all of those qualifications. So he's somebody that you'd want to be listening to. He would be someone that politicians in Europe, mainstream journalists in Europe, should and would be listening to in a normal circumstance. But these are far from normal circumstances.
Now, the policy under which Jacques Beau was sanctioned is CSFP, also European Council Resolution 2025-966. I actually reported on this 2 months ago or something. Yeah, but what it means actually, first of all, it circumvents any courts. Yeah, it's the European Council, and in this case, if I'm not mistaken, it was even Kaya Kallas herself who made this decision. But it entails. I have to apologize. I'm still at the tail end of a flu. My voice is not as strong as it's supposed to be. But it entails asset freezes, travel ban, prohibitions on financial dealings. And I'm not sure that's the case in his case, but I know that they can also freeze the assets of a sanctioned person's periphery. It means your family, your business and everything. Yeah. So basically this is really, how shall I say this, a kind of suicidal, no, suicidal, not suicidal, elimination of a dissenting voice. Which brings me now to you. Are you not concerned that people like you might face a similar fate?
Well, there are already people like me who have, from Germany, Alina Lipp, German independent journalist, effectively not a citizen journalist per se, a legitimate independent journalist who became more of a journalist during her time reporting in Donbass. And because she was reporting on the Donbass side, she was effectively sanctioned and criminalized by the German government because they didn't like the fact that she was actually just reporting on the other side. It's not a question of bias. It's a question of, if you're going to cover a story or a war, wouldn't you want to inform the public in Western Europe what's happening on both sides? And if the mainstream refused to cover the Donbass side, or the Russian side, as it were, then they're only getting half the story. Thomas Roper, he's German. He's also been criminalized and sanctioned effectively by his government. Graham Phillips in the UK was also sanctioned, independent journalist based in Donbass since the Maidan, since 2014. So knows the area very well. So yeah, there's a few others as well that fall into that category. So journalists have already been attacked and sanctioned, but so I suppose I'm concerned, but I've already been sort of marked out by the U.S. government over my previous coverage as well, and so and also banned from social media platforms by sort of blacklists, if you will, U.S. State Department funded blacklists that helped to get me kicked off Twitter and some other platforms. It was called the Hamilton 68 Dashboard. It's funded by the German Marshall Fund. I'm also on Ukrainian enemies of Ukraine lists of enemy journalists in the West and politicians, on two lists in Ukraine, both funded by USAID. So my own government, I'm American, my own government is paying for blacklists which Americans are on in Ukraine. Isn't that just amazing?
The challenge with this is that others might become more and more hesitant in their reporting, right? Self-censorship,
Mm,
companies, or institutions might be hesitant to invite speakers on the topic, etc., etc.
yeah. Well, it's not. For people like myself and people like yourself, who are independent broadcasters, podcasters, we have our own platforms, and many of us own our own platforms in terms of our own websites, our own streaming facilities as well. So we're not fully reliant on YouTube. I've already been through the censorship mill already during the COVID fiasco, and for our coverage on Syria, and also for my coverage generally on East-West Russia, U.S. or Ukraine stories. So for me, this is just another round in a long boxing match with the establishment. But you'll find that a lot of independent journalists like myself, and there's many others I could name, who have been victims of state intimidation. And if you look at the ones that I follow, if you look at their output, they've doubled down. They've gone harder. They've gone harder in their journalism, and more incisive and more critical, and exposing way more than probably they would, because they're motivated. And certainly I would take it the same way. It only motivates me, and it's a mark, it's a badge of honor to be put on these censorship lists by the U.S. government or NATO, or NATO-funded organization, or USAID-funded organization. It just means that you're probably doing a good job. If somebody's trying to silence you or writing hit pieces about you, like The Guardian have done to me, or some of these other mainstream publications, it really just shows you that you're really actually doing a great job in terms of independent journalism. You must be really exposing things that the state or the deep state do not want exposed. Otherwise, they wouldn't be hiring hack journalists to write hit pieces about you and literally putting out lies. You wouldn't be the subject of academic conferences on, quote, disinformation. So clearly they see someone like me as a threat because I'm able to communicate the ideas well, and they find that to be threatening. Whereas if I was just talking about UFOs, or if I was popping off like Alex Jones, I'd have 2 million followers on Twitter.
Absolutely. And I know if someone lives under the illusion, this is in Europe, or it's confined to the Western world, or America, well, Western world. I recently interviewed Susie Dawson, a journalist from New Zealand. I kid you not. She had to flee to Russia. She lives today in Russia because the state of New Zealand, together with the FBI, virtually terrorized her in New Zealand.
Yeah, there are quite a few cases like this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a good time for journalists who go against the mainstream narrative. Now, with your kind permission, so again, there would be a very broad topic that would be interesting with you to discuss, and it would be tempting to scratch on Israel, but I would like to not do this today. Instead, I would really like to focus on let's say Ukraine and Russia, and specifically to start with the speech that Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister and current General Secretary of NATO, gave, and on December 11th, that's what 6 days ago, in Berlin. Amongst other things, he said, "We are Russia's next target, and we are already in harm's way." But he's not alone. We have in the UK, I believe you're in the UK right now, right?
Yes.
Yes. So we have, I don't know if you know him, yeah, but then we have Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton. "We need to be ready to fight, and more families will know what sacrifice to our nation means." Yeah. And not to forget the new MI6 chief, Blaise, don't ask me, Metrevelli. I
Mm,
completely mutilated her name, but also she says the front line is everywhere, and she is specific in the minds and in the screens. I think this is the most dangerous, even. Yeah.
yeah.
So if you take this all together, what's your vision? Where do we go?
Well, we just start with all of these statements, and so you have this sort of consensus chorus across Germany. We're talking here about Brussels, Germany, France, and the UK. Everything else is secondary as far as anyone is concerned. And so this chorus is giving this impression that war is inevitable. That war is inevitable. It's coming. is predicated on two massive lies. The first massive lie that is quite a weak pillar that holds all of this up, which is that Russia is hell bent on invading Western Europe and is going to march all the way to,
Berlin.
over Alsace-Lorraine to Calais, and then ultimately invade Britain. This is how the British are talking. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. But there are people, I think, generally dumb enough to believe that, and it's so funny that the people who are dumb enough and gullible enough to believe it tends to be the sort of uppity middle class, the managerial class. A lot of working class people can see through it. Certainly that's been my impression here. But then there's also a lot of working class people that have been co-opted into more jingoistic, post-Brexit as an example, how they've ramped up the immigration issue quite aggressively. There is a little bit of overlap there in converting that type of nationalism or jingoism into a military nationalism. Basically, it's not very strong, but they've managed to capture a certain percentage there, enough to give it some kind of at least the appearance that there is some impulse of consensus there amongst the public. So this consensus exists in the political class, the managerial class, and the media class. It doesn't really exist in the population. I think that's reflected in the poll numbers of European leaders. In France, Macron is polling 15%, something like that. Keir Starmer, 10%. Friedrich Merz, 18%. And it's very low approval ratings. So, and they're the ones that really the most boisterous and aggressive on the war talk. So what does that tell you? It tells you the public is not clamoring for war. They do not want to suit up their children to go fight in a trench in Ukraine and die effectively. There's just no appetite for it. Russia does not pose an existential threat to Western Europe. However, if they provoke Russia enough and they attack Moscow directly, which they all are planning to do and already have begun doing through drone attacks, Operation Spider's Web, in the hopes that Russia will retaliate in a NATO country and trigger the Article 5 tripwire, which is all that is a tripwire. And they would use that as a green light to escalate possibly to tactical nuclear or possibly even thermonuclear at that point. I mean, that's, to me, I see as a real risk. Russia wants to avoid that at all costs. But I'm confused and wondering whether Europe wants to avoid that at all costs and whether they understand the gravity of that. For Sir Richard Knighton, the chief air marshal, to make that statement that, this generation needs to sacrifice like our previous generations, what's he talking about? He's asking this generation to sacrifice their children at the altar of the military-industrial complex, effectively, okay, or the central banks, effectively. He himself was, born and raised in peacetime. You can't really count the Cold War. Relatively tame compared to what we're looking at now. And the difference is, in World War II and World War I, we didn't have nuclear armed superpowers. This is a different ballgame. A war against Russia in Europe will most likely not feature a lot of conventional ground warfare between Russia and Europe, but it certainly will feature Oreshnik missiles, Kinshal missiles, and other advanced missiles and air power and air defense and so forth, and a lot of asymmetric warfare, for sure. And Europe will take losses. Russia will most certainly take losses. But what is this about ultimately? It's about settling this score in Ukraine. So is it worth it? European politicians have to sell this to their public. Is this worth it? We've instigated this. They will at some point have to fess up to that, but they are probably avoiding doing that because of the layers of propaganda. And the propaganda line is that on February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to do a, quote, full-scale invasion. That's one of their bullet points that they repeat.
Unprovoked.
Unprovoked
Unprovoked.
full-scale invasion. Yes, and this has to be repeated in every statement by every British and European and NATO leader and journalist. They have to keep repeating that because it's used to deflect away from the actual genesis of this conflict, which was the U.S.-backed and engineered coup and European-backed coup in Maidan in February 2014. That's when this civil war started. And the Civil War, I mean, they want us to erase the entire Minsk Accords and the Minsk peace process, as if there wasn't an 8-year civil war in Ukraine. It wasn't bloody and violent. It didn't feature the West backing some of the most extreme Ukrainian nationalist Nazi battalions and killing civilians in Donbass, 14,000 or so. And this is why Russia ultimately intervened, because of the collapse of the Minsk Accords, which Germany, France, and the United States dragged their heels and did everything to sabotage it, as did Petro Poroshenko, the U.S.-installed puppet in Ukraine, followed by the next U.S.-installed puppet. I mean, he was elected, but the process was very much engineered to put Vladimir Zelensky into the presidency, a comedian, in Ukraine, and he also sabotaged the Minsk Accords, even though he himself ran on, bringing peace between Russia and Ukraine. He did obviously the opposite when he came in. So back to these statements by Mark Rutte and all these officials, they're talking about conscription in Germany and France and so forth. So I think I'm hoping that they're not serious about starting World War III, and that this is a ruse to remilitarize Europe, and to also they need to refill the ranks through conscription. And then for instance, in France or Britain, what they would do, or Germany, they would, if they imposed a national service, they know they won't be able to retain all of those people after their 12 or 18-month stint. So what they would do is use that as a sort of soft or interim recruiting process in order to build up a military troop force, and that process would take probably 5 to 8 years to do anything significant. Plus all the training and other costs that are involved in that. I don't see where the money is going to come from for Europe to afford this for any of these countries. If any of these countries tried to join the EU right now, if the EU was conceived now and they look at the economies now, they wouldn't qualify, just based on their debt to GDP ratio. And they're talking about, 5% military spending for what? The cheapest option is obviously a negotiated settlement with Russia, a peaceful settlement to bring this debacle to an end. That is the cheapest option. Go ahead and spend 2% GDP on your military and defense, and that's about all you can afford. And, it's not like even if all of the top European NATO countries ramped up defense production, integration, and all of this, it would take them 10 years to reach the top 4 countries to reach the level that Russia is at. And that would just cost an ungodly sum of money, because the relative purchasing power, what you get for your money in Europe, it's a fraction of what Russia gets in terms of relative purchasing power parity. It's not even close. That's why Russia's defense budget, it looks minuscule on paper at whatever it is at the moment, probably $100 billion a year. But that's the equivalent of a European country spending $500 billion, basically. And this is the sort of basic math that a lot of the Kaliakalis types can't really get their head around, probably because they probably just squeaked by Algebra 2 in high school, or if they're lucky, maybe they got basic history right. That's debatable in her case. So you're dealing with, I think, rank incompetence in the bureaucratic class in Europe. We're seeing the results of this sort of, a lot of the talented, intelligent people fled from public services, from the 1990s forward. And what you get is really the lowest qualified, the person with the least amount of gravitas, the most mediocre people from society and also the most opportunistic in some cases, will find themselves a home in politics. anyone with any talent is in innovation, in tech, in finance, in working in legal. And what you get is the leftovers, and this is the result of the leftovers, is these people don't know anything about anything. They're talking about the fetishization of World War I and World War II is it's crazy to hear this talk in Europe. When I was in high school, it was and in college too, history was drilled into our heads. These were the lessons of World War I. No entangling alliances. Okay. First lesson of World War I. Second lesson, that you shouldn't allow war to be inevitable. The great powers should not sleepwalk into a fait accompli. They need to use diplomacy, and we need multilateral institutions like the ones that were constructed after World War II to prevent a great war or a genocide. So we failed on both of those fronts in the last couple of years. So that's basically all of our Western education post World War II. You can throw it in the bin, because isn't that the whole point of society, of modern Western civilization? So that the next generation's smarter than the last generation? That's what all the state education, everything, our whole society is predicated on these principles. And we failed. Europe has failed miserably. So, I would say Western civilization needs to take a look in the mirror and say, have you really failed in the last, whatever, 60, 70 years? I wouldn't call this a success with everybody talking up a war right now with Russia. I'd say this is the low ebb. In fact, we could make the argument that Western civilization has peaked, and now we're in a sort of regressive phase.
That's a very valid argument. We are at the tail end of between 500 and 600 years of Western dominance, global dominance. And I completely understand, psychologically, I completely understand why the powers to be want to expand the inevitable as long as possible. The question is only how much damage will be caused before the inevitable happens, right?
Mm.
I want to briefly come back to what you said. So there is absolute a drive from largely unelected European officials like Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen to drive us into a war, whilst the population in general is absolutely against it. Now, here in the Netherlands, where I live, they sent out an enquete, how it's called, and they got only 8% response, so from people interested in joining the military, etc., which shows them it's not a very popular thought. Now, we have seen in the past, and now I come back to you, we have seen in the past that whenever this kind of divergence between the goals of the elites and the opinions of the population happens, we see suddenly a either naturally occurring or manufactured crisis in order to stoke enough fear to get the population in line. Do you foresee something like this happening?
No, this is constantly happening, and this has happened throughout history in the West. Okay, and there's many good examples of this. If you follow the arc of this story of Operation Gladio from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and I would argue still in the 2000s, and that was an autonomous cell within NATO intelligence carrying out terrorist attacks on European soil in order to
All
shift
across
public
Europe.
opinion all across Europe. Working with organized crime, working with criminal gangs, doing things like sending criminals into neighborhoods to beat people up, to shoot up convenience stores, set off bombs, in some cases to blame left-wing governments. That was, of course, a big priority for the CIA at the time and in Europe. But it was also to blame left-wing governments, which would then be characterized as being friendly with the Soviet Union or sympathetic with communism. And that was important because there was a big push by the Americans to put nuclear-tipped cruise missiles in Europe at the time. And if you remember, the CND movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, was a quite a formidable political force in the 60s and 70s. And so that's what you were up against politically. Those organizations have been co-opted and marginalized and almost like completely disappeared by now. They don't exist. They've been replaced and usurped by the new green movement. That's another U.S. Uh, ruse, casus belli, that was very cleverly deployed by the Americans over the last 30 years, that culminated in convincing the Germans to shut down their nuclear power plants after Fukushima, and that helped to pave the way for reducing Germany's energy options. Then they shut the coal plants down, and then the Nord Stream sabotage happened. So first, the Nord Stream pipeline project was constructed, Nord Stream 1 and 2. And this is the important conceptual point that a lot of people miss, okay? They look at the Nord Stream sabotage, which happened in July or June, July 2022. That's the preparation, I believe, happened during Baltops, NATO drill Baltops 22, and then the detonation happened in September during the next NATO drill. A lot of people don't know, in September of 2022. Okay, and people look at that and they say, "Oh, that's a reaction to the Ukraine war." No, the Ukraine war, or the acceleration of the conflict in Ukraine by the West, which everybody knew was coming. That's why they armed Ukraine to NATO standard and dragged their heels and sandbagged the Minsk Accords, Germany and France, and specifically in the U.S. So you have to look at the Ukraine war was a reaction to the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Okay, that's why that agenda was fast-tracked. And this was so. If you look at it in terms of energy control, and which, I mean, if you look at the price of LNG right now, the U.S. dominates LNG imports into Europe. Okay, Qatar to the south, U.S. dominates the northern market, and that's the market that really matters. In the last 2 months, record-breaking exports from the U.S. 18.2 billion cubic meters per day average. December, already this year, they broke in that record. So another record-breaking month, December, 18.6 billion cubic meters per day average export from the U.S. They've never had it so good. The Nord Stream sabotage, it has bailed out the U.S. fracking industry, you see. And so while America puts on this front that they want to see the war end, if you notice, the Trump administration hasn't done anything to change the material situation on the ground, and the policy is not changed at all from Joe Biden. There's been some good meetings in terms of Russian-U.S. relations. That's good. We applaud this. We're happy with the rapprochement during the Trump administration, but they're no closer to negotiate settlement under Trump than they are. The only thing, what's pushing the pace of negotiations, or the urgency, is the fact that Russia is doing so well on the ground militarily, and that the corruption scandals in Ukraine are just festering to a level that even Ukrainians are getting sick of it and getting sick of Zelensky. So that's what is pushing the need for negotiations by the U.S. and the Europeans. So, but that's the important point: is total transformation of the energy dependency market, and severing relations between political relations between the East and the West. And that's a huge achievement. And also the remilitarization of Poland and Romania and Finland and Sweden. This is in the Arctic, ultimately, in Scandinavia. This is going to be at the next front line. And if you notice, Donald Trump's not talking about withdrawing from all the 100-odd U.S. Military facilities in Europe, taking a back seat rhetorically. But do you see the exfiltration of U.S. forces out of Europe? I certainly don't. There's 47 new U.S. military bases in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway under construction. Some of them are already online. So all that money's been invested in the militarization of the Arctic and Scandinavia. What does that tell you? That's a much bigger military footprint than in the Middle East. So these things are not spoken about by a lot of commentators, because all focus is on Kiev right now, but long term, I don't see any pivot happening. In fact, it's even more disturbing when what I just said put into context with Trump's comments about we need to take Greenland. Wow. So who is the puppeteer behind Donald Trump? He's not picking this stuff out of his superior intelligence imagination in his little brain. This is coming from somewhere. So he's being prodded. There is a long-term agenda. There is a continuity of policy. And I think it's just a case of that the U.S. establishment, the Anglo-American establishment, believe that they can achieve certain things quicker, possibly under Trump. And then as soon as public opinion riles up to such a degree, he's only got one term to go. God forbid the next 3 years will be, cumulatively as bad as the first year. But the Republicans or the neocons will do things differently, more aggressively, more over the table. The Democrats do things multilaterally, same type of subterfuge, but they conceal it under liberal values and humanitarian interventions, and they do a lot of their subterfuge under the table with a lot of double talk and mealy mouth rhetoric. So it's a difference in style, but ultimately U.S. policy, Anglo-American led policy, which Europe follows, it's very consistent from U.S. administration to U.S. administration.
True.
And so,
True.
yeah, so I'm looking at those things, those data points, and it shows me that, and there's a lot of practical reasons for this because warfare has changed. So navies are
Outdated.
it's
The
outdated.
concept is outdated. Yeah.
Yes. And so submarines are one of the reasons, and nuclear powered submarines is one of the reasons for that. Well, what will be the Russia's main access point for submarines? It's Arctic deployment. In terms of, the Baltic Sea is a lake, effectively now. It's a NATO lake. And the Black Sea, while Russia has increased their control over it, it's still a bottleneck at the Bosphorus, and you have the Mediterranean. Syria is no longer stable. Neither is the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So that's where the West is front-loading all of their future efforts. It will be submarine hunting in the Arctic Northern Passage.
You said a lot of very interesting things. So let me kind of pick a couple of things out. Yeah. So I interviewed Swiss historian Dr. Daniele Ganser, who wrote his PhD on Operation Gladio. Yeah. I really want to underline that CIA and MI6 backed terror groups terrorized, bombed, politically assassinated people across Europe. I mean, Olof Palme falls under this potentially under this category. So those were not some small-time gangsters, right? Then Nord Stream. Now, I interviewed a former Boeing engineer, Eric Anderson, who twice funded a private expedition down to the actual explosion site. Now, to give people an image, and it's a weird one, there is actually still, the second time confirmed, there's actually a US diver Navy boot directly next to the pipeline. You can't make this thing up. Now, I'm not saying because of the diver boot there was a US Navy down there. That's not what I'm saying. Yeah? But one thing is for sure, there was American interest against Nord Stream from the very beginning. Doesn't matter which administration was there. There was incentive and motive and opportunity for the Americans to blow it up. And it's not really relevant if they did it themselves or if they facilitated or if they, but it's clear, and I'm very close with Seymour Hersh here in regards to the details. Yeah? But then coming back to the implications. Now, people talk about the deindustrialization of Germany and by wider context, of course, of Europe, which is fully, people don't understand. This is in line with American interest.
And
A
British.
weak Europe. And sorry, yes, I always just throw those two together. So British, yeah, please.
No, Anglo-American interests for sure. Brexit, you could look at the timing of Brexit. I found to be very curious because at the time, David Cameron had just done a whistle-stop tour of Europe to look at the possibility of renegotiating Britain's EU membership. And so he launched a white paper in February of 2016, I believe. It was called The Best of Both Worlds. And I think it's looking towards a Norwegian-style EU association agreement. So not wanting to be part of the political union, but to maintain all the benefits of the economic union and the Schengen benefits and so forth. Okay. Now, at that same day that white paper was released, then Tory Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron called for a date, announced a referendum for Brexit. Okay. Now, there was no, as far as I could see, there was no public upheaval demanding a Brexit referendum at that time. So there is a debate over the timing of it and why it was such a priority, and it had to get done so quick, you know. And so that's still open for debate. But you know, if the plan by the Americans and the British is to basically undercut Europe and to cause a series of events that would ultimately bankrupt, weaken, fragment, and ultimately bankrupt the European project. And at the center of that European project, as you mentioned, is economic engine is undoubtedly Germany. I would also put the Netherlands in that category as well because of their high level of engineering and manufacturing intelligence, and the technology and intellectual property in Netherlands is formidable, as well as
Chips.
agriculture. Yeah,
Chips.
everything. Um, there's Netherlands, Dutch technology in everything, in German as well, and so, and French. So all of these Northern European powerhouses have been brought down a notch or two as a result of the Ukraine conflict. So we see a pattern, and the pattern is, you know, Americans, what you have to understand is, while Americans, even on the liberal left, they might run with ideological crusades, for a limited period of time. But at the end of the day, Americans' ideology only extends as far as how much is in their wallet. Okay. And normally Americans vote based on economic issues or how they're feeling economically, and they will just as soon back off any green ideological crusade if there's a better option, a better economic option. The Europeans are different. And what you found is the climate issue, the net zero issue, the green issue has kind of replaced religion in 21st century Europe. The ideological investment, people's identities are predicated on their, you know, whether they're a good person or a bad person, of how much they are adopting or buying into these green policies. It's one way to, you know, outwardly broadcast what type of a good citizen you are. And the European investment in this I found to be almost like evangelical in comparison to the Americans. And the result is Germany basically trapped itself to a point where it had no choice but to go to the US for overpriced liquid natural gas coming over the Atlantic. And they even fired up their coal plants. And by firing up their coal plants, they have to pay carbon credits, indulgence fees to the carbon market. So the irony is this has reinvigorated the carbon markets. The Germany burning coal has bailed out the carbon markets. I mean, it's kind of insane. But so Germany's and Europe has been trapped in all these various traps. Ukraine war comes along again. Religious zeal. I mean, this has now supplanted the green identity of virtue signaling. Ukraine has provided for the last 4 years a way that people can. I mean, they had little Ukrainian flags on MEPs' flag holders by their desks in Parliament, and even
Everywhere.
national. Probably in England, every little town or hamlet, the town hall has City Hall or Town Hall has a Ukrainian flag hoisted. Probably the same in your country as well. Pretty much all in Germany, it's definitely that's the case. You see Ukrainian flags everywhere. So there's this desire and politicians and the establishment have played this so well. They played the European public so well because there's a void there. I think a void, a postmodernist void, and we saw this. You could look at this as an extension of the woke kind of phenomenon, but these have geopolitical implications because if it's about manufacturing consent, and it is about manufacturing consent, they have been played. The Europeans have been played by the Americans and somewhat by the British. That's not to say there aren't ideological driven green fanatics in America. There are many, and in Britain, but geopolitically, the Americans and the British have used this to really, really tie Europe down and put them in a corner that is devastating economically. And when your economics, when the economic floor drops out of your project, then you lose political leverage and influence as well. And then you become, again, a vassal state of greater powers. Or you become dependent and reliant on greater powers for defense, for finance. So America would probably love to have Europe start a war with Russia. And as soon as Europe is in a smoldering heap of ash, America will do what it's done twice. It will put all these European countries into debt, and it will come riding in at the last minute and declare victory, and then do the reconstruction or provide the cheap credit and do the rebuilding of the economy. And don't worry, we'll open up American markets to your product. But that's not going to happen because this isn't 1945 anymore. The Asia is the manufacturing hub of the world. There's going to be no German economic miracle after a war with Russia. It's not going to happen. And there's going to be no American manufacturing economic miracle either, because that's not going to happen because $30 and $40 an hour factory wages are not competitive on the global market. So they're selling a lie. And I think there's a level of disorganization and incoherence in all of this that they might get some short-term success from some of these plays and schemes, but geopolitically, strategically, long-term, it's not going to pan out. It's just going to be more pain and suffering. And why? What's the point of all this? Is it so that the Anglo-Americans can steer and lead global civilization, and like they had for the last 1,000 years, or the West for the last 1,000 years, and they just do not want to let go of this? You hear people talk about, it's quite crazy. People say, we can't let China determine, mainline U.S. commentators talk about this. They say, oh, we can't let China run the world and tell, our children won't have free speech and all this other stuff. It's crazy talk. As if China's going to invade North America and change the government or something like that. But this is the way this is used to justify all of these geopolitical positions and the military expenditures and foreign policy, basically, future threats of China or Russia taking over or something.
I would like to very briefly come back to what we said at the beginning, the speech of Rutte and co, and contrast it. I mean, the speech was at the 11th of December, and we contrast it now with Trump's latest national security strategy, which is just a month older. And I'm doing that because there's something really interesting in it. But first, on one side, we have Rutte and co kind of pushing for war. And then we have Trump's national security strategy, which kind of, so first of all, it was written a month before, I said it already, but it goes in the opposite direction. So in it, it's kind of moderating. Yeah? It tries not to see Russia as the primary threat and target. So what do you make? And this is not my main question. I come to something else. Yeah, but what do you make of this discrepancy?
Well, the national security strategy, personally, it looked like it was an undergraduate paper.
Exactly.
You got the same impression.
Yes.
Because when you look at it, it looks like its sections have been copying and pasted from other stuff on the internet, or Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, or the history of Halford Mackinder. So it's very incoherent, and I think it's trying to look intelligent. It's trying to look like it has this grand vision, but they're just cherry picking, interesting ideas from the past, and then wrapping it in this kind of declaration that, the post-Westphalian nation state is the most sacrosanct organizing principle of humans on the planet today, and we must guard the sovereignty of nations. And then right immediately, they're talking about restricting the sovereignty of any nations that are trading with China and Russia, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, but not limited to the Western Hemisphere, and really kind of including Taiwan in that. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. So it's self-contradictory, this document. It's incoherent. It makes very little sense. It's not genuine, and it's not authentic at all. And and this is the problem. You read that document, it's so indicative of the mindset of a lot of people that are in political positions today in the West, is they have a severe lack of imagination. They have a severe lack of vision. They cannot envision the world. They cannot envision a world that's not dominated by Western hegemony, and specifically U.S. led or U.S. dominated. They can't envision power sharing in the future, or it sitting equally at a multipolar arrangement. They can't, they can't envision anything. They don't have the imagination to see, because this does work in parts of the world. If you look, it's already working. So, so the U.S. cannot build anything anymore. The British cannot build. They're very good at sabotage. And so this is the raison d'etat. This is the reason for the state now, geopolitically, is to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative, to disrupt the Middle Corridor, to sabotage the Iranian economy so that their allies are the preeminent powers in the Middle East and Central Asia, to disrupt Russia-India relations and China-Russian relations, China-Japanese détente. So the U.S., this is their all that's left: sabotage, wrecking, destruction. They're building nothing. China is building like crazy in Africa, in Latin America, all over Asia, and in Europe. China is building. America and the British and Europeans are wrecking. And that's the broad theme right now in 2025. So someone has a severe lack of imagination. And this is a post-colonial phase for Europe and for the West. This is like a chronic post-colonial phase. Africa's going through a post-colonial phase, which looks more like a renaissance. Europe's post-colonial phase, this is one of the final chapters in it. And it's not pretty right now. It's not a good look. The population decline, their birth rate has bottomed out, and this is a result of all of these great, brilliant neoliberal policies and cultural inventions post-World War II. Western civilization has totally sabotaged itself, and the political class are just, desperately, just clamoring around, trying to maintain some authority and relevance in this new world, and failing miserably. And the best they can do right now is people like Mark Rutte up there in his 1,200 euro suit, demanding that everybody buckle down for war with Russia, which is completely insane. None of these people have touched grass in Asia, in Russia, in Latin America, or Africa. I guarantee you, none of these European leaders, they don't venture anywhere beyond Tuscany and probably south of France. That's it. That's it. Maybe Sicily, if they're lucky, a villa in Sicily, and skiing in Val d'Isere. Like, that's the extent of their world. Maybe New York, shopping in New York, or if they're really venturous, maybe Kali Kallis went to LA for 4 days. She's really been seeing the world, Meanwhile, the center of gravity, politically, geopolitically, and economically, has shifted eastward, rapidly shifting eastward, rapidly, to the point where European manufacturers are relocating in China, and Chinese manufacturers are popping up in Europe. So This is not 1945. It's
When I
it's
heard
interesting is, yeah, go ahead. Go
when
ahead.
I
Yeah.
heard Rutte's speech and the others that I already mentioned, I had the feeling they were not aware. I mean, they must be aware of Trump's national security strategy. It cannot be that they're not aware, but they just completely neglected it. Yeah. Now I'm looking at this as a behavior analyst. I wrote my thesis on linguistic deception markers in high stakes business negotiations. So I kid you not, I have the document in front of me. There are two words that stuck out for me. Also talking about Trump's national security strategy from November 2025. The word Europe, and through a complete crazy coincidence, the word Europe and the word want, like I want, we want, yeah, both appear 49 times. So it seems to me that this national security strategy is more about Europe than about America. And if you use the word want, it says something about you, the speaker or the writer. Because it's not like, we would like to achieve or we would like to negotiate. No, it's we want, we command. That's the thing.
Mm.
Yeah. So those things, they stuck out for me. But where I want to go with this is, and you scratched on it already, Monroe Doctrine. They call it Trump's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And this I would like you to contrast with Ukraine, where we, the Western world, we claim, look, Ukraine has the right to self-determination, whilst an official security strategy of the US clearly says the Western Hemisphere, which is basically half of the globe, is ours, and everybody in there will do what we are saying. Yeah, please.
Well, just to backtrack, the Trump administration, one of the big features is this criticism of Europe. We saw this opening salvo from J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference
Amazing,
last February.
amazing. Yeah,
So that was the sort of opening public salvo, and what it is this has become a kind of fetishization of seeing criticizing and belittling Europe by the MAGA crowd, because and part of this is predicated on a lack of education on the part of these politicians. They don't understand. The talk, because Trump rode into power with this talking point that NATO has to pay their fair share. We're not going to defend Europe anymore. First, they're acting like Russia is not a threat to Europe. Then they're saying Europe has to pay for their defense against a Russian invasion. Those two things don't really compute. And it's become trendy to criticize and bash Europe, and Elon Musk and others have helped that process by, and of course, there's plenty to criticize in terms of the speech control at the EU level and at the national level, in the UK as well. That's absolutely true. However, Europe, this is not an altruistic exercise to protect Europe that the United States undertook. This is an economic opportunity for America to dominate Europe and to use Europe to launder U.S. dollars. The euro dollar market now is much bigger than the petrodollar market as it pertains to the Gulf Arab countries. So Europe is helping to float and stabilize the U.S. world reserve currency through this outdated arrangement that totally benefits the United States. It always has, and they use that deficit. They use the dollar to deficit spend, and they use their deficit spending to spend trillions of dollars on the military industrial complex, which reinforces their financial hegemony. So it's a self promulgating system that the United States geniusly designed post World War II and then post Bretton Woods, that it really came into shape the U.S. dollar. So the United States has gamed all of the multilateral institutions. So they've benefited from it. They've financialized Wall Street. They offshored their manufacturing through globalization, as did the Europeans and the British. So they're all, but the new conservatives, so-called conservatives, they're using this like, oh, we need to bring the jobs back, and oh, the immigrants are taking, first there's no jobs, and the immigrants are taking the jobs, and we need to bring them back, and the Europeans are ripping us off, China's ripping us off, and all this other stuff. They all got rich off this globalization. Everybody, they financialized and asset stripped and sucked all the real value out of the real economy in the West. And they've all made out like bandits, okay? And now this political class is coming there complaining because it sounds good, okay? But so at the end of the day, U.S. power is predicated on its relationship with its allies and working in a network, okay? The network is where the power is, and the United States dominates that network, and they are able to do what other countries aren't able to do, which is to deficit spend to ungodly levels, because the U.S. is the world reserve currency. There's two sets of rules, economically and politically. The United States doesn't follow any norms economically, but everyone else must have a balanced budget, especially in the EU. So they're vassal states, de facto vassal states, not de jure vassal states, and it's not a formal colonial relationship. But ultimately, this is the genius of the U.S. system. So to me, it's so disingenuous. And what they're doing is actually ultimately the U.S. is shooting itself in the foot, ultimately, because they're also killing one of their cash cows and one of their golden gooses, which is the European and euro dollar market, which will also hasten the demise of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency ultimately. But over to the Monroe Doctrine. So there's no moral, obviously they don't recognize any moral consistency or equivalency when it comes to spheres of influence. But they're also fetishizing the Monroe Doctrine, which neoconservatives and U.S. people have done. That's not why President Monroe wrote the Monroe Doctrine at the time. This was a reaction to really the British. The target was the British and the European colonial powers at the time in the U.S. hemisphere, and the U.S. didn't have a full-blown military to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but it was kind of an opening salvo to say, look, we're going to defend our interests in our hemisphere, and probably looking forward to the Panama Canal project in the subsequent decades, and the Western Hemisphere the post-colonial Western Hemisphere started taking shape, and all those countries had gained independence from Portuguese, Spanish, French. In the case of Haiti, around that time, it was the first black slave colonial revolt was in Haiti. It was a former French colony. And so forth, and the French and the British. So, and the War of 1812, that really showed the vulnerability of the young United States. The British came in and sacked Washington, D.C. and, New Orleans. And in a way, the British took control. They took economic control and really benefited from the U.S., even though it wasn't officially a colony after that. And even though they outlawed slavery, they profited off slavery and the agricultural and textile raw materials that came from the southern states that were then so it became an engine of the British Empire, unofficially, the United States, in that respect. But the U.S. grew and developed its economy and its country and expanded ultimately. But the Monroe Doctrine wasn't a sort of, hemispheric authoritarian decree at the time, but because it's been fetishized, it's been repurposed and redefined to be something that it never was in the first place. Because in the national security strategy, which you talked about, this document, it's going to undermine, the U.S. project in Latin America. The U.S. achieved a great feat in the last 20 years. They managed to pit Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil against each other. And that is quite extraordinary. And they did it very effectively. And guess what? Donald Trump, in just a few months, has basically upended all of that work. And now you have potential a ring of solidarity between Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. Okay. And Colombia was the biggest beneficiary of military aid from the United States, globally number 3 or 4 in terms of military aid in the last 2 decades. And now, and also Israel was very involved in alongside the Americans in Colombia, but not anymore, not after October 7th. There's been a shift there. So the U.S. has, while they're engineering to isolate Venezuela, just like how Trump has energized BRICS and Biden has energized BRICS with the weaponization of the dollar and the sanctions, has accelerated BRICS. Now, Trump is accelerating solidarity in Latin America uh, along BRICS lines, but also along just more independent lines. So now Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, potentially, maybe possibly Chile. It depends. And the U.S. is very involved in meddling in the Honduran election right now. That's a really important election. Trump is very involved in meddling in the Argentinian election as well. He used an economic bribe to help Milei win the midterms. You know, that's a level of interference. You know, that's a serious. Just the aid alone, that size of an aid package is unheard of in U.S. history. Okay, it's bigger than anything the IMF would come up with either. And so, and ironically, Trump was demonized during his first term for being a product of, quote, foreign interference, which was a fake Russiagate plot. But you'd think that he would want to not be involved in interfering in other countries' electoral outcomes, and yet this is what he's doing aggressively in the first year of his first term. That really undercuts the Monroe Doctrine pitch from the U.S., and it shows that the national security strategy paper is inconsistent and insincere in terms of respecting the sovereignty of nations. So you can't.
Exactly.
They want it
Yep.
both ways, and it's people are not, especially Latin America. There is a renaissance of independence and self-sufficiency right now in Latin America that is historic, and I would say in Africa is not far behind them. And Washington's way behind on these developments. They think it's still 1970, and they can still go in there and literally deploy jets to go bomb a presidential palace like they did on September 11th in 1973 when they killed Salvador Allende while he was in the presidential palace, Henry Kissinger, in the Nixon administration. It's not. This isn't those days anymore. But if you listen to Marco Rubio and Trump and what they're attempting to do in Venezuela at the moment, it's worse than under Bush. You know, at least we had the theater under Bush. You know, the WMDs, the whole run up. They needed to work on the public to make that happen. It took years to engineer that. They've dispensed with all of that now, and so we're living in a really strange, very volatile time. And the disturbing part about this in America is there's no pushback from the Democrats on this. So there's no liberal left solidarity between any of these countries in Latin America and the U.S. Left doesn't exist. You've got a uniparty establishment that the neocons and the neoliberals are on the same page. And this really exposes just the level of corruption right now. And I will just draw a line under this point that history will look back probably. I don't know who's coming next, but the Trump administration will be regarded as the most openly corrupt U.S. government. And yet, I'm someone who really believed that Donald Trump, I took him for his word on the campaign trail because we are all so desperate to break from the status quo of everything that came before that a lot of people thought, okay, we'll give him a chance. And this is a level of open corruption, smash and grab, stealing oil tankers, now declaring that Venezuela has stolen U.S. Like the oil that Venezuela has Trump says it's ours. You stole it from us. You stole our land, apparently. I'm trying to work out where the U.S. land in Venezuela is. This is a new
I
one.
heard it. Yeah, I heard it.
How do we respond to this? I mean, I don't have anything to compare it with in my life. No one's ever seen anything like crazy like this. No pushback from the Democrats. They did push the congressional resolution on the War Powers Act, and it was very close, 216 to 210 votes. So it had pretty much a whip line vote on the Democrat side against Trump's war in Venezuela, or at least having to have a vote in Congress. But it's a few dissenters on the Republican side, but like this the United States, what they're doing to their reputation and their ability to project power and to have trust internationally going forward, it's to me it's permanently damaged as a result of this. And you can't go to Moscow and think about
patronize
you,
them, yeah, with a
the other
finger.
negotiations, your
Yeah,
credibility in the Middle East, in China, in Moscow, in Europe. You're supposed to have the respect and at least the impression of being an honest broker. At least the impression of it, even though if you're not to say the CIA didn't overthrow 90 something governments in the last 80 years or were involved in so many coups, but there was still the public impression that America could stabilize the situation and balance the scales and de-escalate if necessary. This is not possible now, and that can go badly historically because then you have a Hobbesian state of nature. This is like extreme realism in the international system, anarchy, and the irony is that the U.S. doesn't recognize international law, nor do its allies when they're engaged in legal activities, but they demand that everybody else follows it by the letter.
yeah. That
And
law is for you guys, but not for us. Yes, absolutely.
yes, yes.
Also, international institutions, ICG, ICJ, ICC, ICJ, it's for the others. The moment, it became a bit hot for NATO members or America, it's no longer, I mean, they put ICC or ICJ such as on the sanction list. I mean, how,
Mm.
you know, I mean, this is inconceivable.
The UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, for the
Albanese, yeah.
occupied, she's been debanked and sanctioned by U.S. institutions. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, Karim Khan is chief prosecutor at the ICC in The Hague. He's British. The British have not stood up for him. He is British. He's a British barrister, and they've just left him out to dry. I mean, so
Mm.
it's and that pressure is coming from the U.S. and of course from Israel as well. But we could say the same about a lot of other cases as well, along the same lines. So, um, and these institutions, the U.S. has dominated these institutions, even the ones they're not members of, even though they didn't sign the Rome Statute for the ICC. They have people in Eurojust. They have observers in The Hague. They're very, very involved in the process there. If you go and look at the names and you start to audit the organization, I got a peek in there when I was doing my postgraduate in global security international relations, my master's degree. Part of the module was that we had an induction at The Hague, and there was Americans there. So although they're not involved as a signatory, ultimately one would argue that they have effective control over the court and the outcomes as well. And this is done through a lot of under the table work. And so, but that's where U.S. power resides. It's through the WTO. It's through the UN. It's through the UN Security Council. So Trump and this new way of populist thinking in some ways is throwing the baby out with the bathwater and will ultimately weaken U.S. hegemony as a result.
I understand. Patrick, I have one gem that I kept for last. I saved the best for last that I would like to run by you. If we think this through, let's say those warmongers in Brussels get away and there will be a war contained or not with Russia outside of Ukraine. Now what happens? Now I looked into some of the NATO exercises, especially Vintex CIMEX from 1989. Does that ring a bell at all?
Mm, I'm not sure.
Okay,
Maybe.
so these were NATO exercises, and specifically in 1989, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl pulled out. Why? Because between 1983, that's Able Archer were these kind of groups, and then from 1983 to 1989, Vintex CIMEX. The practiced and planned to drop 300 nuclear bombs. Where? Not on Russia, on Europe. So again,
Mm,
the German chancellor was so alarmed that he pulled out of those exercises. Now, the only thing that's changed in my perspective is now that these exercises are way more classified, digitized. They have now a PR section where embedded reporters can kind of observe what's visible, but I guarantee you they will not tell the public that they're still planning to bomb, to nuke basically Europe, and not only Germany, Europe, in order to halt Russian advances, which they know they cannot combat with conventional weapons. Yeah. So I would like to emphasize, and this is because, I mean, I was stunned when I read this first. I mean, it is meanwhile publicly available information. It's declassified. 300 nuclear weapons, and they already deployed them on day 3, right?
mm.
So for those, and this is why I'm bringing this up, for those who think casually in terms of, yeah, tactical nukes, they're small little nukes. This is city by city. First of all, that's an illusion. And second, the nukes, they will not drop on Russia. They will drop on Europe. And this is also why I'm saying America is not protecting Europe. It's the other way around. On a geopolitical level, Europe as a battlefield for America is protecting
Yes.
America. Am I making this too black and white?
Well, I mean, the military exercises from that period, and there's been there's been a transition in terms of military strategy and battlefield tactics and strategy since then. But um, that the U.S. position in Europe and the European defenses in NATO was geared towards large ground war, and Soviets as well. And the amount of troops amassed in Germany, for instance, previously, in the 80s, British and American troops. I mean, it's like many-fold more than what are there now. Now it's scaled down in terms of the British to almost nothing, and to the Americans, just a relative skeleton force compared to what it was from the 1980s and previously during the Cold War. So, so, but I think the exercise you're talking about speaks to the values of how the Americans ultimately, if it came to a head, they view Europe as collateral damage, and maybe and not a priority in the sense that it's not resource rich enough to be a priority. So there's nothing of value there if you're looking at it in a post World War III uh, sort of scenario. And there's many of these scenarios um, that that are possible, but I think I think uh, I think East-West relations and the whole point of the Western orientation against the East has changed. In reality, it's changed, but in the political minds of, let's say, the older class that are still in power in Europe, still the heads of think tanks, still the heads of military. These are all Cold Warriors, many of them, the older ones. And you mentioned some of them before, Sir Richard Knighton in Britain, and, the types of people at Chatham House and Russi. They're either children of the Cold War or they're Cold Warriors themselves. And they're still the architects. And geopolitically, their ideas in the national security strategy document, it's Mackinderite geopolitics. So that's 200-year-old Anglo-American geopolitical strategy. But the problem is, when that was conceived in the late 1700s, in terms of Britain competing against Russia or trying to prevent Russia from having a strong trade and geopolitical link with India at the time, which was becoming a major British colony. And then after the First and Second World War, the United States inherited a lot of the uh, uh, power of the seas, mercantile control and power that was the foundation of the British Empire, and the Americans inherited a lot of this, including the Middle East after the Suez crisis as well. Still Anglo-American, and then you can see that in the writings of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And so we're still in this same mode of thought. America, Washington, London, New York have not changed. And they dictate Europe's orientation against the East, you see. And that's the whole point of NATO, was to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. And that's the first NATO Secretary General who said that, Lord Hastings Ismay. So that's his words, okay? So, but the problem is, 2025, China is not an economic backwater strung out on opium anymore. Neither is India. India is not a peasant backwater. These are formidable economies and civilizational states, China and India specifically. But the whole of Southeast Asia, it's nothing, doesn't resemble anything like it did in the last 120 years. So this geopolitical idea of controlling the Eurasian landmass, it's irrelevant. It might have been relevant before. It may have been. It worked for the British and then somewhat for the Americans in the latter part of the 20th century. Kind of made sense. But as soon as the era of globalization kicked in 1990, it is fast become irrelevant. But they're still pursuing the same ideological and civilizational obsessions that their forefathers did in the West. But it's a completely outdated operating system for this world that's changed. This is why nothing is working. This is why it's not going to work. And it's only going to end in tears at the end of the day for Europe. And, you know, I weep for Europe, but, you know, its greatest strength during its colonial apex has become its greatest weakness, unfortunately. And it would take some absolutely exceptional, intelligent leadership to emerge in some European states. It wouldn't need a lot. We just need maybe one or two states to take the lead. Rhetorically, ideologically, and geopolitically, we see impulses of this with Hungary. Viktor Orban and the Central European states. The Czech Republic is also recently declared in the last few weeks that it will not be funding the Ukraine war. So you have Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Central Europe, who share the front line in Ukraine, dissenting against Brussels and the British. And so that's a start. But, you know, it has to go beyond just AFD, single issue politics, you know, anti-immigration politics. You need much more intelligent, imaginative statecraft. And this is one of the problems with Brussels, is Brussels has neutered individual European member states now. It's taken away their ability to express their individual sovereign foreign policy. This is a huge, huge change that's happened, where the EU is harmonized with NATO. That wasn't the case before. France wasn't even in NATO before
Charles
the
de Gaulle.
Libya. Yes, yeah, and even before Libya, before Sarkozy. You know, they came back into NATO just in time for that one. But that's an American project. It's a British and it's an Anglo-American project, NATO, at the end of the day. And but the Ukraine war has allowed, you know, Mehdi Frederickson and some of these Kalikalis to sort of grandstand and punch way above their weight, you know, to pretend that they are, you know, powerful statespeople, when in fact they're just absolutely pathetic vassals of, you know, an American-dominated military Keynesianism is now the only economic option for these European countries. There's nothing left. Do you remember a couple of years ago, Thomas, it was good green jobs. We're going to bring good green jobs. Now it's good defense jobs. This is what they're all saying now. We're going to deliver good defense jobs. We're going to drone manufacturing and this and that. So what kind of a future is this for the young generation? You know, So there's a disconnect here generationally as well. And I'm not convinced the youth are locked into the same mode of thinking as the Mark Ruters of the world.
Not at all, which is why they are attacking social media platforms across the platform.
Mm,
Yeah, I don't know. I
yes.
don't want to digress, and I know you were very generous with your time. Maybe last point: chat control. Chat control. The EU want to implement a law that obligates any such platform to monitor basically everything on all platforms and report. And the same is true for companies like Apple with on-device AI. Anyway, I digressing. We are going into what seems to me very dark times in terms of control, manipulation, propaganda, and war. And I would like you to end with a positive note if you can.
Well, it's certainly things are really coming to a head on all fronts. The speech chat control issue on the EU level is very disturbing, and it is a very, and also the imposition of a digital ID, which seems to be a big agenda between all European countries and all the sort of Western countries, and CBDCs as well, central bank digital currencies, and all of these sort of that are ultimately control mechanisms. I think in a digital world, and I would I'm paraphrasing Julian Assange, who made a statement about this. I don't know if it was recently or not, but at some point. And he said, in this new digital world, with the level of integration, it's inevitable that we will be subsumed by the state to varying degrees, but it's inevitable. So then the question is, what type of state is that? And this is one of the paradoxes of the current situation. If you look at the dissident community or the freedom movement, as many like to call it, or the independent media, etc., many of them are not engaged in the political process at all, other than commentating. They don't vote. I know many of them. They don't vote. They're not registered with any parties. So they've kind of left the political process up to the sycophantic, mediocre managerial class, bureaucrats, and the results are pretty horrific. And I know there are many capable and motivated and passionate people that could make a difference. The problem is they view the system as broken, and they view the two-party duopolies in most countries, power sharing arrangements, as corrupt and ineffectual, and the system is corrupt. So the question is, how much can we get involved politically and in shaping that state, taking control of the machinery of government to mold it and make it into something that reflects what people's values actually are, and not the top-down imposition of what is being foisted upon the public right now. That is the big question. That's the big challenge, because otherwise, this is, I don't know if it's going to end in tears or just in some outrageous Orwellian dystopic society, where everybody's being switched on and off or canceled at the whim of an AI algorithm, perhaps. So these are not easy questions, not easy issues right now, but it is up to us to impose ourselves on the system, in politically and in media, and using these platforms. And I've been canceled. I've been struck off. I've been disappeared, and I've come back. And you just have to be relentless. And everybody, rather than be afraid, they just have to be relentless. And I think the best rule of thumb is, and when I was kicked off of Twitter for a year and a half for saying that the COVID vaccines might be dangerous for pregnant women. That got me banned from Twitter for a year and a half. And Elon Musk let me back on after when he bought the platform. But now I'm being shadow banned because I'm criticizing Elon Musk. But the point is during that time, I developed other channels and communication lines on Telegram and other platforms, and worked really hard to do that, And that's what you have to do, and you have to do live events, and we've had some successful live events in the last year. I've spoken at some very successful events that have had a great impact, and we have to double up our efforts, and it's not easy. There's a lot of resistance, a lot of problems that people are encountering, but at the same time, I see people are very active, and I see people, younger people, also very passionate, very active. So it does give me great hope that that the youth are switched on. They do get it. They are paying attention, and many of them are ready to put their selves on the line. And that's, I think, something positive. So, yeah, we the older ones have to be good examples and good thinkers and express our ideas clearly and do our homework, and that helps everybody who's coming up through the ranks, gives them confidence that they understand the issues really well and are able to make their arguments really clearly, and that's also very important. So we do have a responsibility there. The older generation have a big responsibility.
Patrick, on that note, it was my pleasure talking to you, and I really hope we can do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Thomas.